Hello everybody and welcome to the first lesson in a series on the history of Christianity for the Philosophy Academy. In this video, what we're going to do is take an introduction to the subject. We will talk about what it means to study the history of Christianity. Is it simply just about the study of what happened in the past? Well, we'll think about some of the historiographical things to be associated with this study as well. We will think about the subfields and various different disciplines and approaches to this area of study. We're not just mixing our idea of history here, we are mixing also ideas associated with archaeology, with the study of biblical texts, with historical theology, study of very specific parts of Christian history as well, all of which are very important. Before we then start thinking about the methodologies and the kinds of sources that we're going to be relying upon, and then examining the scope of this series of lessons, essentially thinking about the roadmap of where we're going to be going with regards to the history of this subject. So that's what we're essentially going to do in this video, looking at these different subjects and these different areas of study. And I guess we could begin by just thinking, what does it actually mean to study the history of Christianity? Well, it's fairly self-explanatory in some regards, but it is also a little bit more complicated in others. I guess you could say that the study of the history of Christianity refers to the study of how Christianity as a religion has developed over time, how its beliefs, its institutions, its practices, and its communities have interacted with society, and how this has shaped the way in which we think about Christianity today as a major world religion. The study of Christianity, though, is both theological and historical in terms of a discipline. It studies the historical development of Christian thinking, but it also thinks about the idea of historical theology, the idea of thinking about how various different theological aspects of Christianity have developed. Where does the doctrine of the Trinity come from? What historical elements can we think about there? What kind of influences do these early conceptualizations of Christianity have? How do we think about the ways in which this theology is influenced by previous historical elements, and what does that say about the various different elements of theological integrity related to these very important doctrines? But it's not just about doctrine. It's not just about Christian doctrine. It's also, and about Christian theology, it's also about social history, how Christians lived, how they had a relationship to the state. So it's a political history. The relationship between, for example, the church and the Roman Empire is very, very important. It's also a cultural history, the way in which art developed, the way in which liturgy developed, and so too with architecture. For the most part, scholars then begin to break this subject down into a collection of subfields, and potentially in the future I might go into these in more detail as distinct series of videos on these various topics. But what we will do is engage in a collection of and a sort of holistic approach to all of these different subfields, and we will look at them all from various different perspectives. One of these subfields is the study of patrology, or patristics. This is the study of the Church Fathers, the early Christian writers from the 1st to around the 8th century CE. The Christian Fathers are the Church Fathers are very, very, very important, especially when we think about why and how early doctrinal debates take place. These early doctrinal debates really influence how canon of Scripture is developed and how heresies are defined. So one of the things that we will come to learn throughout this series of lessons, and we'll come to learn when we study this in more detail as a separate series, is that early Christianity following the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ is very, very much in flux in terms of what is and what isn't part of church doctrine. And it really takes a good few hundred years before we start to see what become known as the ecumenical councils that begin to codify what is orthodoxy, what is the correct Christian doctrine, and what is heresy by extension. But sort of prior to these kinds of the councils of Constantinople, the councils of Nicaea, and all of these different ecumenical councils, there is a lot that is in flux. It's really almost, in some circumstances, a free game as to what counts as being Christian doctrine and what doesn't. What parts of the scripture are heretical and what are part of the basic orthodoxy. And so what we see here is that patristic studies use textual criticism, they use historical context, and sometimes maybe even looking at some comparative language studies to interpret these works. So, of course, these are not all written in a single language. They are written in Greek, in Latin, in Coptic, and other languages as well. The study of historical theology, then, is the study of how Christian beliefs, how Christian doctrine has changed and developed over time. So, the history of Christianity is a really broad and all-encompassing subject of study, because on the one hand, we are going to be looking at the development of Christian doctrine. We're going to talk about how this doctrine was developed, but we're also going to be doing it from the context and from the perspective of historians, from the perspective of people who are examining specifically the institutional context in which these doctrines were developed. So, for example, how the doctrine of the Trinity became formulated is going to be less looking at this from a theological angle, but more from the sort of socio-political and institutional perspective of the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople, and how theological movements like the Reformation and modern theology shifted understandings of grace and sin and church authority, but again, thinking about this from a socio-political perspective. Why the Reformation happened, how the Reformation happened in, and when did the Reformation happen in various different parts of Europe. We'll be doing the similar things when we relate to things like the Great Schism between the Orthodoxy and the Catholic churches, and we will also apply this to various other rules about the development of the Roman Empire, the creation of the Byzantine Empire, and all of these different establishments as well. So the main point that I'm going to be making here is that we're going to be considering social, political, and cultural influences on theology, not just the ideas of theology in isolation, and not just the development of these ideas in isolation either. We're going to think about how these communities and their historical circumstances begin to shape the beliefs that we have, or at least that we had in the past in some circumstances, and that we now have today in the present. Of course, when we think about the methodologies then, so the methodology for studying Christian history, of course, this is an introductory series of lessons. I'm not personally qualified to teach anything more than a sort of introductory series of lessons as somebody who holds an undergraduate degree in philosophy. But fundamentally, the methodologies are going to be similar in teaching an introductory series of lessons on the history of Christianity as somebody who is an academic studying in a scholarly context. We will be engaging with some primary textual sources. We'll be engaging with some of the writings of the Church Fathers, people like Athanasius, people like Origen, and people like Augustine. We'll be thinking about the various different conciliar documents, the creeds and the canons of the church councils. We will talk about early Christian literature, some of the letters, some of the theological treatises, some of the sort of martyrdom accounts. We will be making reference to biblical texts as well. Of course, the very early point of Christian history, when we're talking about the sort of life and ministry of Jesus, and we're thinking about the crucifixion of Christ, there are non-biblical sources for the crucifixion. So we know with a pretty high degree of certainty that that Christ was crucified. But beyond that, beyond the fact that Christ was crucified and that Pontius Pilate was an individual who was there in Jerusalem, we don't know much more. There's more to be known there that really comes from the biblical text. And so when we think about the biblical text, we will think about that from the perspective of the fact that they are biblical texts. So we have to be very careful to derive any kind of historical accuracy. And we'll get to that in a second when we look at challenges. But we will also look at critical historical method. We're going to be applying basic principles that historians would apply. We're thinking about the general rules of historical method to Christian sources. We will think about textual criticism. We will think about contextualizing these sources. We will the added difficulty that historians of religion obviously have to deal with is the fact that the main source of knowledge about Christianity or about Islam or about Judaism comes from the biblical texts that these religions derive from, and of course we have to take them with a pinch of salt as well. They come from the Bible or the Torah or the Quran. But of course, there are supporting disciplines, and this is a little bit more into the advanced area that we're not going to be looking at in too much detail in terms of an introductory series of lessons. But people will involve themselves in the subject of paleography, the study of ancient handwriting and the study of ancient languages and these different kinds of things to authenticate manuscripts. Diplomatics, the analysis of historical documents to assess their origin. Archaeology, the study of excavation and the study of looking at the ancient worlds through excavation and through archaeological analysis. We'll look at sociology and anthropology, looking at Christian communities as a society, as a people, as well as codicology, or codicology, the examining of manuscripts and languages, the ancient languages, for how these texts developed. Again, that's a little bit more advanced stuff. If you're somebody who's going to be studying this at university at an undergraduate level or even at a postgraduate and maybe even a research level, then you'll be engaging more in that kind of stuff in more detail. Before I outline the scope of this series of lessons, I just want to spend a bit of time thinking about the challenges that face historians of Christianity. We're going to be going on a 2,000-year journey through the history of Christianity in this series of lessons. So what are the difficulties that we can face in the study of this area? Well, of course, the point that I made earlier on is the historical reliability of sources, especially when we are thinking about the early development of Christianity. We're thinking about this period around the 1st century CE, which is going to be the first series of lessons that we're looking at. We are really looking at a lot of biblical sources, and this does raise the question about their historical reliability. While many scholars accept, in fact all scholars pretty much accept that Jesus existed as an individual, and most scholars accept that he was crucified, there is debate about how historically accurate the rest of the documentation is. The rest of this story is really left up to the Gospels. And some early Christian writings are theological in nature as well, which provides us with even more problems, given the fact that because they're not purely historical, it raises a question about, firstly, issues concerning bias and intention and literal truth, but it also raises questions about how to disentangle the literal truth, the historical accuracy of some of these really early periods from doctrinal storytelling. That becomes very, very difficult. And like I said, when we're going to spend so much of our time looking at the 1st century CE and we're thinking about some of the big changes and the big developments that happens in this 1st century, we know that big things do happen. We know that someone called Jesus did exist. We know that he was almost definitely crucified. We know that Pontius Pilate existed. In fact, there's confirmation of that relatively recently with coins that show conclusively that he existed. But from there, we're sort of left to some spatterings of historical sources from different places, but for the most part, we're left to looking at the biblical texts. And so, just bear that in mind when we write about this in this kind of way. We also should note that early Christian historians, actual historians, people like Eusebius, for example, often had very theological motives, and they had often quite a lot of theological flair associated with their writings, to show divine providence, for example, or to legitimize the church, or to defend a particular type of orthodoxy. And this means that they end up going back and revising some of the issues of a historical importance to make them fit to a greater extent the things that had been agreed at various different councils and various different agreements since those events had taken place. And so modern historians have to critically engage with these biases as part of the historiography. And this is why Christian history is very difficult, because not only are we talking about essentially ancient history in this regard, but we're also thinking about the fact that ancient history is difficult enough as it is compared to, let's say, history of the 20th century, but it is also very difficult in the sense that we're having to disentangle mythology and theology from history. There is also interdisciplinary tensions in the sense that a tension between theologians and historians. The theologian will emphasize the doctrinal continuity and the divine action. Historians will emphasize the socio-political and cultural causation that sits here. Biblical scholars may lack necessarily formal training in historical methodology in some cases. Of course, this is a debate within academia about the extent to which historians should engage deeply with the theological nuance and vice versa, the extent to which theologians should engage with the historical developments. That's a debate to be had for academics in universities. And then we also have to think about the fact that, at least early on, we're talking about the history of Christianity as in a quite localized area. We're talking about sort of in the region of the Mediterranean and North Africa, and just in and around the sort of the location of the Roman Empire, which is fine. That's okay. We can study that kind of history. But when it begins to grow and begins to become a solidified global imperial religion, in the sense that it was spread by empires, firstly spread by the Roman Empire and then spread by other empires like the Spanish Empire and the British Empire later on, it becomes a global religion. So how do we study global religion? Well, it becomes a study of the world, essentially. So this obviously raises questions about sources. It raises questions about the impact of colonialism and decolonization narratives. And it also recognizes that there are lots of different Christian experiences. So if you thought the study of Christianity wasn't difficult enough, when we've got difficult sources to rely on, we've got such a long time ago, we've got such bias and interdisciplinary tensions, or now add on to the fact that it becomes global as time goes on. And then finally, for some scholars and for some people, Christianity is not just a historical subject, but it's also a living faith. And so this can influence how people interpret their sources. Historians have to navigate their own beliefs, their own methodological standards and academic rigor when thinking about the development of a religion. And that can obviously also contribute to and impact the ways in which we examine this area of study. There's more that can be said about the sort of meta-historical study of Christianity, what it means to study Christianity as a history, but I'm going to start thinking now about the scope of this series of lessons, okay? So the first introductory videos are going to be looking at the various different influences on Christianity, thinking about the socio-economic, political, cultural aspects and the setting in which Christianity begins to develop. So we're going to begin by thinking about Greek influences on Christianity from the sort of philosophical perspective. And we will think about Roman influences on Christianity, again from a philosophical perspective, but also from a socio-political perspective. It is the Roman Empire, it is first century Judea, in which we see the establishment of and the growth of Christianity. We will then also look at ancient Jewish influences, because of course Christianity is heavily influenced and is a sort of, at least in the earlier period, was a sort of side development, a sort of sub-element of broader Judaic philosophy and Judaic theology as well. We're then going to spend quite a lot of time talking about the origins of Christianity. Really, in my opinion, the most interesting periods of the history of Christianity is the 1st to the 4th century CE, the really early development. That's really where my interests lie fundamentally, but we will go further, don't worry. We're going to begin looking about the origins of Christianity. We'll talk about the crucifixion of Christ, Jesus, and what we know about Jesus, what we know about resurrection, what about the early Christian communities in Jerusalem immediately after his death, and then start thinking about some early Christian persecutions. We'll spend a good couple of lessons thinking about the Apostle Paul, and then the broader persecution that we start to see when we see the growth of Christianity. This will take us from the 2nd all the way to the 4th century CE. Again, this is a period of quite extensive persecutions. We'll talk about the Decian persecutions, the Valerian persecutions. We'll talk about the Ante-Nicene expansion, and we will start to think about the institutionalization and conversion by the Roman Empire, the point at which we start to see the Edict of Milan, and we start to see Emperor Constantine develop and adopt Christian practices. We'll then move on to the 4th and 5th century CE, where we see quite a lot of theological consolidation. Okay, that will be a really important topic before then thinking about post the 5th century, where we start to see the rise of the papal power, the rise of the papacy. And this becomes very important because this starts to lay the groundwork for what eventually becomes the Great Schism, given the fact that medieval Christianity during this time period is beginning to develop within the papacy on the one hand, within the sort of Catholic papacy on the one hand, and then you're also seeing a development of Christianity in the Eastern Orthodox world of the Byzantine Empire on the other. And so this obviously does eventually lead to the Great Schism between Catholic and Orthodox Christianities, and this is going to be the subject of the sort of medieval period. You'll notice as well that the sort of resolution of our historical inquiry begins to expand. We're going to spend a good 20 or so lessons, even more than that, looking at Christianity from the 1st century to the 5th century, the first sort of 500 years. And then from there, we're going to spend a few lessons looking at the next 1,000 years of Christian history, before thinking in more detail about the Reformation and the development of Protestantism in the 16th century, the expansion then between the 16th and the 19th centuries of Christianity as the result of modern imperialism, modern colonialism from the British Empire, the Spanish empires, the French empires, etc., etc. And then the final two topics are going to look at Christianity in the 20th century and then contemporary Christianity in the 21st. Now, in terms of citations and further reading, I'm actually going to have to flip this around a little bit, because fundamentally the best single volume sources that you might want to find are the History of Christianity, 2000 Years of Faith by Collins and Price, as well as Gascoigne's Brief History of Christianity, if you want to just have a single volume to look at. In terms of citations, though, one of the things that I've done for this series of lessons as a sort of revamped history of Christianity is that I am reading through conclusively the entire Cambridge History of Christianity, volumes 1 to 9. So bear in mind that will actually go, the bottom bit here will actually go into the citations as we go along. It's a very dense text, but that's what I'm doing as part of the sort of additional elements for this series of lessons. So I hope you've enjoyed this introductory video. I hope you've enjoyed the sort of kinds of questions that we're going to be asking, and I hope you stay tuned for future lessons. The next lesson, like I said, is going to look at Greek influences on Christianity, and then we'll start looking at the development of Christianity and the origins of Christianity in the 1st century. New lessons to be coming within the next couple of months from the time of recording this one. So stay tuned, and thank you everyone for watching this video.